Okay, so normally, Priscilla, I
Yeah.
talk to people for about 5 to 10 minutes before I start pressing record on this Zoom. But for you, I just got you on the Zoom. We've barely spoken, and I was like, I don't want to waste any of this
Oh,
in our private convo prior. And that could just be because, I mean, this is a very heartfelt book, and you lay it all out. You lay your heart, your soul, your family history, everything on the line, and I am so grateful for it. I read this book in 2 days flat. I couldn't stop reading.
wow.
It's called The Critic's Daughter by Priscilla Gilman. And oh my goodness. So
Oh.
I have so many questions.
Oh.
And I guess the first one is, in many ways, for me, this book was about you getting your own voice, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That
Mhm.
was the journey. I mean, it's about divorce. It's about being the child of these very well-known parents. It's an Upper West Side world that is now gone.
Yes.
And and it was such like a beautiful slice of history. There's all, I mean, we have so much to talk about, but really the through line for me was, here's this young woman who has to be good, 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 and the cheerleader of the family, and finally finds her own voice. Did you see it that way, or is that something that I'm bringing up for the first time?
I didn't see it that way when I was starting, but as I was writing it and finding my voice, I did start to see it that way. And I think especially when I was in As You Like It, which I talk about towards the end of the book, with my son performing at his school, and acting again and singing again, and realizing how much I had given up to be the perfect good girl for my parents, for my family, and really feeling like I was telling the complete and full truth for the first time about what I experienced.
About your life. Now, just for
Yeah.
people that, I mean, I'm just going to catch people up, because whoever's watching this, like, so who's Priscilla Gilman? Priscilla's
Sure.
parents are the very famous agent Lynn Nesbitt, whom I have met once, I believe, but I know her reputation. You know, everybody knows her reputation who's in the literary world. And your
Mhm.
dad was Richard Gilman, who
Mhm.
was a very well-known critic.
Mhm.
And there was a scene there where you talk about Susan Sontag walking in to read the bedtime story, and then followed by Joan Didion. It's like, it was like, it was like, it was like every famous writer, Donald Barthelme, like every famous writer was coming in to read you a bedtime story. So talk a little bit first about what it was like growing up in the kind of milieu that I was so fascinated with, because I grew up in the suburbs. Like, that wasn't my milieu at
Oh, I
all.
didn't know that. I didn't know
Mhm.
that.
I grew
Okay.
up in Potomac, Maryland, in the suburbs, nothing like that at all. So tell me what it was like to have Susan Sontag read you a bedtime story.
And I didn't know that she was Susan Sontag, but I did know that she was rather intimidating and forbidding looking when I first laid eyes on her. And then she was quite lovely, and you could see all of these sort of august, ostensibly imperious or intimidating figures like relax, because I think my sister, who's a year, just 14 months younger than I am, so we're basically twins, our sort of embrace of these people, and oh, come meet Peter Rabbit and Benjamin Bunny and tell us a story and let us tell you about the Oz books that we're reading. I think it was disarming, relaxing, and fun for them,
Right.
because they got to put aside their critical personae or their worldly reputations or their need to be always formidable, and
Right.
they could just be playful and childlike with us.
I love that scene so much, it will stick in my head forever. But
Oh.
what really, what this book was also was a very interesting view into the child's view of divorce, but from a woman who has spent a lot of time with a therapist to understand what that was. And what's very refreshing to me was that you paint neither your mother nor your father as all bad or all good. You give a very
Yeah.
nuanced portrait of each of them. So
Thank you.
only one of them still alive.
Yes.
And what did your mom, I mean, your mom is a literary agent. This is what she does. She sells books like yours out in
Yes.
the world. So
Yes.
you give her the opportunity to read this first, or what was her thoughts on this?
Deb, I absolutely gave her the opportunity to read it, but she declined.
Oh, that's a really nice thing that she did.
I know. And it's interesting. My ex-husband did the same thing with my first book, which is about our son who is autistic, and much more about my marriage and the breakup of that marriage. He actually did read this one. He's brilliant and knows my mom well and helped me. I think, my mom, we're very close. I love my mother dearly. I'm so glad that you saw it as like, it's definitely, from my perspective, a book about learning to see your parents in the round, learning to see your parents as complicated, flawed people doing the best they can. And I absolutely think my parents should have split up. I've heard, like, there was one reader who said, oh, she blames her mother for the divorce. I don't blame my mother for the divorce at all. The divorce was necessary for both of them. And they both ended up better as a result of splitting up.
I actually think this will help a lot of people, both who are getting divorced and whose parents are getting divorced, because it really does paint a realistic picture where, sometimes marriages don't work out.
Sometimes they don't.
And sometimes it's better for the children.
Yes.
To have the parents split up. Now, what I said to you, the only thing I said privately to you before we got on this public Zoom, was that there's a passage here, and I think it's on page 131, that actually allowed me to see divorce from my children's perspective and have a greater understanding for what that meant, because my parents didn't get divorced. So really reading this, which is at your age, writing about you at that age, opened my eyes in ways that I had never been open before. Would you mind reading just that paragraph? It starts with, I didn't have the courage, and then it ends with nothing of, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure. So this is, just to give it a little bit of context, Jill Cremens, who was a family friend, was doing a book called What It Feels Like When Parents Divorce. And she had invited me and my sister to participate in this book, which would mean that she would take photographs of us and she would interview us and she would put our words into the book. And my mother said, why would you want to do this? This is private. This isn't something to talk about. And I thought, I can't expose my father's depression and despair in print, and I don't really want to do this. But then when she sent me the book, Jill sent me the book when it came out, and she talks about how much courage it took for these children to speak openly about their parents' divorce. And so I've read this passage, and I'm sitting at my desk. I'm in 7th or 8th grade. I didn't have the courage to talk openly about my fears, my sorrows, my confusions. Or rather, I wasn't given permission to do so for myself as well as my parents. I knew that to participate in this book would have been an act of rebellion against my mother and a betrayal of my father. It would have meant defying my mother's wishes and exposing my father in all his vulnerability to the world's scrutiny. It would also have been to own emotions we weren't supposed to have. We were not to be sad. We were not to be afraid or confused. It was my father who was sad, fearful, confused. My mother had contempt for his dissolution. She insisted on positivity. The split was a good thing, a positive step. My father relied on my positivity to keep him from shattering into fragments that could never be reassembled. And with both of them, by being cheerful and energizing, understanding and accepting was what made them happy. I was an effervescent girl with a great gaggle of friends and a zest for life. But there were breaks, cracks, gulfs of sorrow deep inside me that my parents and my friends knew nothing of.
So I read that, and I had two thoughts when I finished reading that. First thought, I need to reach out to my children and talk about
ask them about their cracks.
Ask them about their cracks. But second thought was, oh my God, Jill Cremens came to your family, asked you to be in this book. You said no. And now this book that you've written is kind of an answer to her questions.
Oh, it is. Oh, absolutely.
And by the way, side note, Jill Cremens, who I was just friends with on Facebook, when my marriage broke up, reached out to me and to my then 7-year-old son and invited us over and took us out for dinner, and was a very steady presence in our lives for about a year after my marriage broke up. And I had no idea that she'd written this book. I didn't know about this book. I knew about the very young dancer, I knew the very young gymnast, I knew all the but I didn't know about the divorce book. And reading that, I was like, oh, that's why she reached out. She really understood this.
She really understood this. And I don't think the book is in print. I got it, I got a used copy of it because I didn't have my copy anymore because I wanted to go back and read through it again. Let's hope maybe this will bring it back into print.
Yeah.
Come on, publishers, bring it into print because it's really incredible. All of her books. I mean, and I was obsessed with all those very youngs and dancer, gymnast, skater, writer, all of them, circus performer.
Right. They were amazing.
Oh,
very young dancer was in both of my sister and my room, and we worshipped that book and worshipped that girl and wished we were on the stage dancing, the Nutcracker, all that.
Yes.
No, but that's actually a good segue to you were a performer growing up. You performed in schools, you performed in plays, you loved it. You loved it and you dropped it. And the way that you talk about that is brilliant. I'm just going to ask you a question. What happened? Why did you drop these things? How did it have to do with the divorce and your parents' view of art, which is really interesting because your dad's a critic and your mom's a literary agent, so they deal with artists all the time.
Exactly. And I think maybe because they dealt with artists all the time, they didn't want that unstable, difficult life for their child. And, my mom had actually gone to Northwestern for acting. She got an acting scholarship for college. She wanted to be an actress. And then she switched out of the acting program into oral interpretation of literature because she was so horrified by the competitiveness and like cutthroat nature of the drama department. And I think, when I was a little girl, I was in some sort of off Broadway stuff that just happened through my ballet school. And people would say to my parents, you should get her an agent, you should have her audition for Annie. And they were united in their absolute determination that I would never be given voice lessons, never have an agent, never go anywhere near that.
Right.
And I think that after they split up, I sang in a vocal jazz ensemble in high school, and I did a lot of musical theater in high school, but never anything that would lead to anything professional, right? Like my friends were going to summer acting programs and they had voice teachers and they had coaches, and it was no. This was just fun. And I think I got hardened in that position because it was one of the few things that my parents agreed on.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right. I get it.
So after they split, I was like, okay, by giving up any dream of being a singer or an actor, I can unite my parents.
Oh, that's brilliant. I get it. I totally.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing that I thought I found really touching and important in the book was a discussion of wealthy poverty. And when I say wealthy poverty, I mean, when your dad left the marriage, he suddenly had no money. And I was in that same position where there was one moment in my divorce or in my separation where I went to buy apples at the farmer's market, and I was waiting for some money to come in for various assignments and magazine stories that I had done, and they hadn't come in, and I had $6 left in my account and I couldn't buy the apples. And it's a moment that I've not soon forgotten, probably never will.
You never will.
But you wrote about a moment where going to your dad's and the stains on the glasses and the splitting of the soda and the splitting of the counting out of the Cheetos. I mean, there's some incredible details there that really sat with me and made me think, thank you for doing this. Thank you for putting this in there. Because no, seriously, because I think it's important that, we live in a New York City, a wealthy city, and divorce, especially when one parent has been the primary caregiver, is often hard.
I'm so glad that resonated with you. It was really important to me. And it was another secret that I kept from my mom because I didn't want my mom to
Worry.
know and worry about me going over there. But, you know, we would go to lunches and dinners to very inexpensive places on the Upper West Side. And he would make me and my sister split a meal because he didn't want to pay. He feared that he wouldn't be able to pay for two.
Right.
And, you know, I think the timing of their split also was 1980 into 81. And it was right when the Upper West Side was starting to take off and become really expensive.
And Reagan became president that year, right? So it's like
absolutely. Oh my gosh, Deb, thank you for mentioning that, because my parents actually had an election night party in 1980.
Yeah.
And I remember, I had already been told that they were going to split up, but their friends didn't know. And they hosted this party. And I remember the fear and the tension and the sadness that was involved in. Everybody was crying when Reagan won. And I remember Joan Kennedy was at the party and she was saying, oh my gosh, if only Ted had been the nominee, maybe he would have been. And then my mother, of course, goes on to be Jimmy Carter's agent, which is so ironic. Right. But I remember sitting there and thinking, Reagan's going to be really bad for people like my dad. Yeah. And I'm really worried. And, you know, the apartment that I grew up in, it was rent controlled. It was in, this might be something that your viewers / readers would be interested in. The building that I grew up in, 333 Central Park West.
Next to Alexandra Crapenzano, my friend.
Oh, Alexandra, my love. I was just going to say, and her mom, Jane Kramer, wrote this incredible piece about the building that was in the New Yorker.
Oh, I haven't seen that. I got to find it.
About 5 years ago. Yeah. About all the incredible characters who lived in the building, from the Seavers to Pauline Kael, and I mean, Alexander Cockburn. It was just incredible. And then when my parents bought an apartment on West 77th Street for $140,000, 3,200 square foot apartment. Yeah. And there was like a drug rehab facility on the block. We had a neighborhood block association. But I just remember in real time seeing Columbus Avenue become chic.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, this is so cool. I'm in this cool, fun neighborhood. And then having this pang and thinking, my father's not going to be able to afford to live in this neighborhood anymore.
Yeah. And he wasn't.
And then he wasn't.
And then you guys lived near the Royfies.
The Royfies! We lived in the Royfies building!
Like, Katie's my good friend, Alexandra. Like, you're sort of talking about all my friends' families.
Wow. Yeah, Becky's was one of my absolute best friends. And the Royfies were angels in my father's life.
Yeah, I saw that they really held on to him when he was in his moment of crisis and sadness, and helped him find a place in their building. Yeah,
they really did. And Herman Royfield, I'll never forget, I mentioned in it, this was a full-length scene. You would have appreciated this one, Deb, but it ended up on the cutting room floor. But Brearley had a father-daughter dance my senior year in high school. And this was not typical for my school, Brearley, which was like a radical feminist, very left-wing school. And my father was sort of horrified. It was at Doubles, that fancy club. And my father and Herman Royfi were the only two fathers who didn't wear tuxes.
No, that did make it in the book. I read that. That's in
I mentioned it briefly, but there was a full scene.
Got it. Yeah.
And I was like, Herman, I love you. Thank God for you. Thank God for you.
That's great. Yeah. That was a great scene. So, what would your father was a book critic, right?
I know, yes.
If you were to examine your book through your father's eyes, knowing that he loves you and of course is going to love your book, but what would that be? How would he criticize? How would he write the review of your book?
You know, I put on the page some of my struggle with that, where I write about how I talk about one of his critical precepts, which comes from George Bernard Shaw: loyalty in a critic is corruption. Mm-hmm. And that any moment where I was tempted to omit or soften, or there were a few things that I was going to keep out, and my editor was like, he would have wanted you to put them in. Like, you have to put everything in, and you have to put scenes where he looks, where he's acting in ways that are scary, and so I really channeled my father in telling the whole truth without whitewashing it, without softening it. But throughout, I think the story is irradiated by my deep love for him, which is a love that's more profound than the love that I had for him when I was a child, where I just sort of, in an unqualified way, adored him and worshiped him.
Right.
You know, it's a love that sees very clearly and without wavering his flaws, his limitations, the ways that he could be difficult, the ways that he could be challenging.
Yeah.
And yet, and I think that this is, you know, this is what he did with playwrights. This is what he did with plays. This is what he did with books. And he taught me how to love in this deep, full way that doesn't deny a person's complexity. And I think at the end of the book, you know, there's a beautiful piece in the Wall Street Journal today by a former student of his who's writing about the book. And she talks about how at the end of the book, I quote from Hamlet, and I talk about how my father wrote about how Hamlet is always mysterious and enigmatic, and we can never fully master him or know him or understand him or label him. And that's what I want to leave readers with about my father. In other words, this is a portrait of my father. I am attempting to capture him and depict him, but I'm also wanting to respect the essential mystery of my father. His memoir was called Faith, Sex, Mystery.
Right.
He always wanted to end with mystery.
Right.
And wonder. So I hope that that's what people come away from the book. They feel, oh, they've lived with Richard Gilman. They've lived in his head. They've read his writing. They've experienced what it was like to be his daughter. And they get him and they have a sense of him, but there's also boundless mystery around him, as there is around any of us.
And a little bit of pulling back the curtain. For example, one scene that sticks out in my mind is he loved Annie. He loved the play. And I teared up a little bit at that, because I thought, here's this major theater critic who can, you know, make or break a play, and he's sitting with his daughters and Annie and crying. And
Deb, exactly. And he, you know, I didn't want to hide that he could be sentimental and that he loved Murder, She Wrote. I talk also about how we used to watch Murder, She Wrote together. And he identified with Daddy Warbucks and that relationship with Annie. And I wanted to depict him in all of his kind of messy, contradictory complexity. Because he was this of contradictions, lots of contradictions.
It was amazing. And now I also want to find out, for example, you write about that Eric Simonoff is your agent, who I love as well.
Oh,
how did you find your way to Eric? Because I know that you yourself were an agent at your mom's agency. So tell me about the journey from being an agent to becoming a writer and finding the agent of your dreams.
Okay, interesting. So I started, my first agent was Tina Bennett, who was my friend in grad school. She's in the book. She's the person who's sort of helping my dad. And she dropped out of Yale after a year. And I remember we went to coffee and she said, I'm really interested in working in publishing, but I don't really know anyone. And Deb, I've been the gatekeeper for my mother for my life. Like people, oh, I have a novel. Nope, the wall goes down. No. Tina, I was like, I think, Mom, you are going to want to talk to her. So she went and talked to my mom and Mort Janklow, and they hired her, and she worked her way up and became one of the most famous agents in the world.
She's amazing. I know her.
Amazing.
She's brilliant. She's brilliant. Yeah.
One of my best friends. Her sister turned out was my friend at summer camp. We didn't realize this until 2 months into our friendship. And Eric was my colleague at Janklow, and so I knew him because he worked at Norton, actually, interestingly, and then was a classics major at Princeton, came to Janklow, and was just my friend. And I mean, he's such a mensch. He's brilliant. He has incredible taste. And both Tina and Eric left Janklow and went to WME. Mm-hmm. And Tina sold this book. Tina was my agent when it was sold. And then she left WME in some kind of dramatic circumstances where she wasn't allowed to work for a year. And so the head of the literary division called me and said, Eric Simonoff has volunteered to take over for your book. And I was like, bring it on. That's great. And so I had two of the most incredible agents in the world who were also dear friends of mine and like my big brother and sister. And I am a very lucky girl.
Well, I'm going to tell you an Eric Simonoff story that I've never told publicly, but and maybe Eric will be sad if I say this, but he might if I say this. When I was getting an agent for Shutterbait, my first book, Eric was one of the people that I sent some chapters to, and he called me on the phone. I remember I was pushing two kids in a double stroller, and I'm on those big phones on the Upper West Side, like the 1998 giant like bricks. And I'm talking to him, and he said, you know, I like this book a lot. And who are the other agents that are in the running? And I told him the other two agents that were in the running, and he named one of them, and he said, oh, she's so good. she's better for this book, and put himself out of the running because he felt it would serve the book better to have this woman to sell the book. And, you know, he was probably right, you know.
Quintessential Eric Simonoff,
Right.
Deb.
So not what I heard agents were like, you know, cutthroat, but he has continued, and every one of my interactions with him, to be a mensch.
He is, I mean, his picture should be in the dictionary next to the word mensch. I'm serious. I tell him that all the time. And both of them are absolutely brilliant. Have nothing, no taint of schmooze or fakeness or any of those problematic qualities that we sometimes associate with the word agent.
Yeah.
And they both were, my mom trained them both, so it's really interesting.
So that's really great. So, you know, we're running out of time here, and I don't want to go on too long, but now that you have found your voice, which you really have found your voice, I hope you're going to be writing more books. And I would like to know, I know it's not, I hate when people ask me, what are you working on now? But what do you think you might want to work on in the future?
A lot of things. So I feel so gratified and honored by your points about my voice. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful voice.
I have always wanted to write children's books, and I will do it at some point. And this book actually started as an idea that I had for, I love the Betsy Tacy books, which I grew up with. My mom grew up with them. A series about two girls growing up on the Upper West Side, with the parents that, you know, that I had sort of disguised with the gay brother and the literary scene. And so I may do that at some point. I am also, you know, I'm a literature teacher. And I was a professor of English at Yale and then at Vassar, and still I lead 6 book groups, and I teach for Yale.
6 book groups?
I do.
Do you lead book groups with John Schwartz? Is that one of the things that you do? Does he do that?
Not with John, not with John, but yeah, I have a classics book group that I've taught for 7 years, and I teach literature classes for Yale Alumni College.
Okay.
So and my mother, she didn't really want me to write this book, Deb. I mean, come on, who would? Yeah. But she got behind it, and she was very supportive. But she's always said, "You're so brilliant." I mean, this is funny because this is relevant to the book. You've read it now, right? Like, you should be a scholar. You should write about books. Don't write about yourself. Write about books. So I do want to write a book about the books of my life and how and why I've chosen the books that I love to teach the most.
Oh, I would love that.
Yeah, so I will write books about books and teaching, and maybe one children's books that I love and one on adult novels that I love. So Song of Solomon, Wuthering Heights, Tess, you know, a lot of great books that I love.
But does fiction speak to you at all, or not at all?
It does. It does. You know, I wrote both of my memoirs. I structured them like novels. I wanted them to be suspenseful. I created characters. I do teach a mixed genre writing class of fiction and nonfiction. I represented fiction when I was an agent. I'm a book critic for the Boston Globe. I review mostly fiction. I think I have a novel in me. I think it would be fun and liberating, Deb.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, going from memoir to novel, I did it twice. I'm not sure I'll ever go back there, but it was.
Thanks for the warning.
It's fun for a moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Priscilla, I really, I thank you for this book, The Critic's Daughter. I felt like it was really one of the first times since COVID where I could ignore everything and I could not think about anything else, and I could just dive into this book. I was taking care of my mom at the same time, so I should have been more frantic and sort of scattered, but this really allowed me to focus for the first time in a long time. I think it's a beautiful book. I want to thank Eric Alterman for turning me on to it. Like, thank
you, Eric Alterman. That was random.
No, I mean,
because Deb, you and I are Facebook friends, but we've never met. We've never communicated. I've always admired you from afar.
I've always admired you from afar too.
About you, you know?
Well, now we have to meet in real life.
We do.
But what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to end this public conversation. I'll get back and talk privately with you for a moment. But thank you so much for
talking so much
with me, and I can't wait to share this book with other people. And thank you so much.
Thank you.